I met James Broughton and Joel Singer at the Epiphany Party, the annual party for Epiphany at the home of Ronald Chase in the sort of greater mission area of San Francisco in what we think is January of 1985. It was quite a party, it always is, with everything from the young students that he worked with up to artists of all ages, and really quite a heterogeneous party and quite wonderful party in this very strange apartment in the middle of what had been an industrial building. And I remember thinking, oh, these guys are really very nice and very interesting. And the friendship began there and then. We were friends. It's interesting when you ask the question that way, my relationship with James. I didn't have a separate relationship with James, really. I had a relationship with James and Joel. And oddly enough, it always was in that order. James was many years older than Joel and a very strong character. Not that Joel isn't. Joel is very strong, but James was the more outgoing, perhaps, of the two, and rather more visible in the relationship, perhaps. And but it was always with the two of them. They would stay at my house. I would go up and visit them in Port Townsend. As often happens, the friendship really intensified when they moved away. I've found that with other people in my life. One often sees people who live far away more often and more intensely than one does with people who live nearby, because one makes an effort to be with them when you're in the same place at the same time, instead of sort of thinking or below thinking that, oh, well, I don't need to see them, I'll see them next week or next month or something. That's not the case when somebody lives far away. So we were friends for many years until, well, I'm still friends with Joel, still good friends with Joel, although he now lives 3,000 miles away. Oh, it wasn't great. You couldn't escape AIDS in those days. You'd walk down the street, at least in certain parts of the city, and there would be people obviously afflicted with the disease who were there walking around. Everybody had friends who were ill and dying. I remember having a patient who had lost 32 people out of his social network. And he was devastated. And it took years of working together before he came back. I think that was not unusual in those days. That wasn't my case, but that was the case of many people. I don't. Even if James had been all caught up in it, and I knew it at the time, I might not remember it now. Well, in my own case, and I don't know whether this was true of James and Joel, I had a few inner friends who died, but only a few. It is not the case that my entire social network was wiped out. And I suspect that was true, the same is true of James, so that maybe nobody could avoid the crisis. If you read the gay papers, the BAR particularly, every week there were 10 obituaries in the back, and it was really depressing. And people kept disappearing. But if it didn't affect your inner social network, it was a different experience. Some people yes, some people no. On the other hand, it was a major phenomenon of our time. And so even if you wanted to minimize the effect on yourself, you couldn't do that very much. You had to be affected. I can remember visits to the house in Port Townsend, which they ended up living in. One of the memorable experiences was Joel's cooking. Joel was a great cook and a great organizer of meals, and I can remember sitting down in their rather small dining room, either with just the three of us or with other people, and having a really wonderful meal with monumental jollity, if you use a word that James would have used. It was a very welcoming house. They were a very welcoming couple of people, and that really felt good. I can remember touring around Port Townsend with them, seeing the Army base that had been converted into a state park. One clear impact was he was a role model for me about aging. I asked you a few minutes ago when he was born, and I was astounded at the answer. My father was born in 1901. I was born in 1930. James is closer to my father than he is to me. And when he was alive, I never thought about him that way. I think we all have a tendency to, and I know I have a tendency to compress. If I like somebody and feel comfortable with them, I think of them as being in my generation, whether they're a generation older or a generation younger. I compress it in my mind, and certainly James was that way. Towards the end, when he became feeble, I mean, it was very clear he was feeble. He was really old, and he was on his way out, as we say. But that was only a small portion of the time that I knew him, and mostly he was a twinkling elder gentleman, if you will. I thought of him. He treated me rather the way he treated most everybody, men anyway. It didn't matter how young they were or how old they were. He would treat them with playfulness and, how shall I say it, a certain amount of flirtiness. And that was fun. It was fun for everybody, whether one took it seriously or not. Does one ever know what makes anybody tick? What makes you tick? What makes me tick? I don't know that there are simple answers to these questions. I think the major feature of James's life that struck me was the bifurcation of it. He met Joel when he was 63, if I recall correctly, 62 maybe. That is not young. I mean, at 62 or 3, one has lived an entire life. One may have another life coming for 20 or 30 years more, but that's already a full life. And he made a major switch when he met Joel and divorced and essentially married Joel and went on as a couple from that point on. Having made something analogous, not so dramatic, but something analogous myself, I know of how momentous that change must have been, was. It's simply a matter of fact. So that's one enormous thing that I would characterize his life by. Secondly, he was creative, and I think that was a major part of his life. He was always creating as long as he lived. I am not a poet. I know very little about poetry. I think I'm on solid ground when I say that James's poetry was different from that of most poets. His verse was simple, sometimes deceptively simple. He liked to write about things that were everyday and words that were everyday. And my guess is that in the context of poetry and poets, that was considered weird. He preached following not only one's weird, but following one's bent, one's impulses, one's intuitions, as compared to being too cerebral and thinking and planning out everything. I think he was a master of and a champion of spontaneity. And some people would would consider that weird. Again, I don't, but some people certainly would and did. This is it, and I'm it, and you are it, and so is that. And he is it, she is it, and it is it, and that is that. Oh, it is this, and it is thus, and it is them, and it is us. And it is now, and here it is, and here we are, and this is it. Oh, often, often. It was then surprising to me. Maybe now that I'm closer to the age of the sort of the center of our friendship, it should surprise me less. It does surprise me less. But at the time, it surprised me that he was as sexually minded as he was at his advanced age. I think I'll stop there. He was minimally outrageous sometimes in his flirtiness with waiters, with house guests, with anybody. I went back and forth between thinking, oh, well, he's only talking, and thinking quite the opposite. And of course, I never resolved that question. I never asked him. It didn't matter. But, and I don't mean to say that I'm so easily shocked, but sometimes he surprised me. Oh, almost anything. The foibles of the world, a good joke. Of course, laughing is the far end of being amused. It certainly pleased him when he was given his due as a creative artist, whether the poetry or the films. I can remember being at the San Francisco Art Institute for a retrospective in the auditorium there, and he was certainly shining that day. He was extremely happy, as anybody would be. Most favorite thing was the twinkle. James managed to maintain his twinkle as long as I knew him. And it's a way of being and a way of relating to people that on others could, I suppose, be unattractive. There's a certain irony or reservation or something when one finds everything amusing. But on him, it didn't seem that way at all. It just seemed that he was able to be amused by much of what happened in the world. Ooh. Least favorite things about James. I really don't have any, but I do remember when he was not well, that he was just marginally what I think one would call petulant. I mean, he was a little irritable. I'm irritable whenever I'm ill, and I mean, whether it's a cold or anything else. So I wouldn't really say that was the least favorite thing about him. He was human. Well, we'll know in another 10 years. I think I've said it already. I learned from him to age gracefully. Well, I hope I've learned that too. I'd say James, unlike most Americans, allowed death into his life. James was an evoker and a fan of erotic love in a way that was striking. He certainly incorporated intense love in his friendships, and that was an example to me, for instance, as well as to everybody else around him, I suppose. I'm not sure how much of a believer I am in that. I think James was blessed not only with brains and charm, but also with a very pleasing body and appearance. With Joel's help, Joel was an acolyte. It is easier for one to see oneself as a God body when somebody is around all the time telling you that you're a God body. I unfortunately have never had that, at least not to the extent that James had it. But when I look in a mirror, I don't see myself that way. There's a certain, and I don't mean this in any critical sense, but there's a certain pride that is part of that attitude. James had that. He had that. There's the one film about his childhood and his homecoming in Modesto, in which he was the star of the whole thing, and you can sort of see the pride there that goes back a generation or two. So I think that's all tied together. Well, I don't even have a favorite restaurant, so you're not going to get me to say one part of the body. Three places: the head, the heart, and the cock, or whatever. Three places. James Broughton was an inspiration for me. James Broughton was an accomplished artist in two different media. That's not very common, film and poetry writing. James Broughton was a very good friend, capital F. When I saw his films, I was reminded of a couple of other filmmakers. One was Warhol, and the other was a very famous experimental filmmaker whose name escapes me at the moment, the one with the eyeball. Very, very famous. But so James's films were not like films that I was used to seeing. They were experimental or avant-garde or something non-linear, whatever you want to call it. But again, I'm not in either the world of film or the world of poetry, and I know very little about how he was taken. I do know that he, unfortunately, I think, never became one of the better-known names in either field that I'm aware of in the United States as a whole. He was well-known locally here in San Francisco, but that's not the world. It's not the country. I don't know. I don't know enough about how one becomes well-known in the field. I suppose in the plastic arts, like painting and sculpture, one has to have two or three things. One has to have a nature that is self-aggrandizing. One has to have a sponsoring gallery or studio or a chain of theaters or something to get the work out there. And one has to have a patron, somebody with a lot of money who can get the thing started. I don't know that James had any one of the three. He seemed to me very outgoing and certainly charming. Nobody was more charming than James. But I don't know, somewhere along the line, probably before I ever met him, something didn't happen. And what that was, I don't know. Maybe there was enough money from beginning to end so that he could eat and do the traveling he wanted to do without pushing himself. I don't know. It's possible. Oh, well, any work that gets at human truths remains relevant forever. James was talking about confidence, having confidence in oneself. He was talking about spontaneity. He was talking about interest in and acceptance of the world. He was talking about eros, the importance of love, both erotic and non-erotic love. Those are all themes that continue to be as relevant now as they were 40 years ago and 100 years ago. Be yourself. One message that I derived from from James's work is be yourself. I don't know that James ever talked about the public reaction to his films, but I do retain a sense that he always felt a little bit wistful about the fact that he was not more of a star in that world nationally. And I can't give you chapter and verse as to what he ever said that gave me that impression. And maybe he never said anything. Maybe it was just a combination of what I knew about him and his work on the one hand, and what I read or didn't read about him in the book reviews and the magazines and so on. I really don't know. We're talking, after all, about, well, 30 years ago. I don't know. I do know that there are poets since who have written not in the style that he wrote, which was special, but who have written in more of a traditional style about things that are very ordinary. And they have become stars, selling, thousands and thousands of books and being on television all the time and so on. That was not James Broughton's fate. I didn't know him early enough or in a context to know whether, if he had been willing to tack 20 degrees in some direction or other, he could have had the fame and so on, and celebrity that he might have enjoyed. I don't know the answer to that. If you think about it, knowing what I know about him and knowing his work somewhat and knowing what happened and didn't happen, you might think, well, he was stubborn and just found his tack and stayed on it, and it meant that he wasn't going to become famous and wasn't going to sell hundreds of thousands of books. And he didn't care. He made his choices, and the consequences were as they were. That's sort of my guess, but I don't know. Tales about being visited by some muse originally struck me as fanciful and not very reliable, et cetera, et cetera. I've evolved a lot through the years, and I'm much more accepting of things like that, at least on the level of metaphor. I think James was a fanciful person, playful and fanciful, and creative in a visual and poetic way. And so it's not surprising that he should tell that tale as if it happened, whether or not he actually believed that it happened. I mean, it's how else are you going to say, I got an inspiration? Some people put it in religious terms, and some people just do what James did with it. He was a more creative person than most of the people I've known in my life, and that apparently from a very early age. So how do you explain that? Is it in the genes? I don't know. What I remember about James's film The Bed, one thing I remember, and this is really off the point, is that it was made on Mount Tamalpais, and Mount Tamalpais being very close to here, and a place that I've often visited, that gave it a particular interest for me. But I remember the humorousness of The Bed. The bed is descending a mountain. Why that should be a movie that made money whereas others didn't, I can't tell you. I wish I could understand that. It was so unusual. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was very joyful. The question of what was he sexually is an interesting one given his history. But of course, one isn't one thing throughout one's life. James, I think, may be a notable example of somebody He was bisexual up to age 62 or 3 and then gay after that. When you say it out loud like that, it doesn't make any sense. And if you ask me what I believe with Freud that everybody is born potentially bisexual or ambisexual, as we say now. And we fall into or choose paths for ourselves. And once you've chosen a path, from day one on, it's constricting. If you choose to be straight, you can be that for a long time, maybe 60 years before the other part of you comes out. If you choose to be gay, you're probably also closing off possibilities of being with the other sex. Well, he was a very sensible man, and he probably would give the advice that many sensible people would give to young people today. The world is a mess. You don't have a responsibility for that, but two things. One, you do have some responsibility to do whatever you can to make it less of a mess. But secondly, even though it's a mess, lead your life in a way that brings you joy to the best of your ability. Well, it's pretty trite what I would want to say to James if he were alive now. I suppose I would say, thanks for being a good friend. Well, there are two ways to approach the question of what influence Joel Singer had on James Broughton, the professional and the personal. The professional I know less about, although I know that there were at least one or two films that they made jointly, and I have no idea what the relative relationship was on the films. Personally, it's difficult to think of James without Joel. Joel was, excuse the expression, his muse, I think, for the years that they were together, meaning inspiration, sounding board, emotional support, probably more intellectual stimulus than most of us are aware. And chief motivator, I'm sure, motivator in chief. And also in terms of their physical, their temporal life together. I have the impression anyway that Joel did the planning for the trips. Joel did the everyday things like buying the food and cooking the food so that it would be there. I think even when James was well, much less when he began to decline, Joel did everything. I don't think the influence of Joel on James can be exaggerated. I think it was a very big influence. The bliss of width. You have come to me out of the antiquities. We have loved one another for generations. We have loved one another for centuries. You teach me to trust the voice of my voices. You teach me to believe my own believings. You touch the palpability of my possibles. Together we reflect what our mirrors conceal. Together we upgrade the sun in our meridians. We remain open night and day to transcendence. You are incompletely disguised as a mortal. You are the eternal stranger I have always known. I saw your wings this morning. I saw your wings. When you tickle my cravings and sniff my privacies, when you douse my terror and launch my dismemberment, I salute you in the name of all that intimidates me and pray for a mild winter. But you take me apart and put me back differently. You mend my tatters and refasten my seams. You patch my pieces and tie my ends up. Then you totally unravel me. You have deranged my accounts, unbalanced my books, crossed my live wires, and torn up my agendas. I salute you in gratitude for this devastation. You are my undoing and my altogether. James Broughton was a funny man. James Broughton was a sweetie. James Broughton was my friend.